Bikers harass blind veteran's daughter at a diner until one phone call changes everything. In the quiet town of Eagles Ridge, Pennsylvania, former Special Forces soldier Sarah Carter thought she had left the battlefield behind until a notorious biker gang walked into Maggie's diner. When they target her blind veteran father and attempt to intimidate her, they quickly realize they've made a grave mistake. With one phone call, Sarah summons a force they never expected. What unfolds next is a gripping tale of courage, justice, and an unbreakable bond between a daughter and her father. Some battles aren't fought with weapons, but with strength, unity, and the will to stand against darkness. Welcome back. Before we start, remember to hit the like and subscribe for the new stories every day. The autumn light slanted through the windows of Maggie's diner, catching dust motes as they danced in the still air. Outside, the maple trees that lined Main Street in Eagles Ridge, Pennsylvania, had begun their annual transformation, their leaves turning from summer green to bold crimson and amber. The small town nestled in the foothills of the Appalachians was known for its quiet dignity, a place where neighbors still knew each other's names, where handshakes meant something, and where people looked out for one another. Thomas Carter's weathered fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup, his unseeing eyes gazing somewhere beyond the worn Formica tabletop. At 63, his once proud posture now curved slightly, but there remained something unmistakably military in the way he held himself. The cane propped against the booth beside him bore silent witness to his sacrifices, as did the burn scars that crept up from his collar and the milky cast to his eyes. Permanent reminders of an IED explosion outside Kandahar that had sent him home to darkness 15 years ago. "More coffee, Thomas?" Maggie Pearson asked, her voice as warm and rich as the brew she offered. Thomas tilted his face upward, his smile finding Maggie by instinct rather than sight. "That would be lovely, Maggie. Sarah should be here any minute." The bell above the diner door chimed, and Thomas's smile widened. "And there she is now. How do you always know?" Sarah asked, sliding into the booth across from her father, the leather seat sighing beneath her weight. Thomas's laugh was soft. "The perfume your mother gave you before she passed. You've worn it every day since you came back to Eagles Ridge." Sarah reached across the table, her hand finding her father's with practiced ease. At 35, Sarah Carter carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen too much of the world to be easily rattled. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and though she wore civilian clothes, jeans and a simple blue button-down, there was a vigilance in her hazel eyes that never quite dimmed. "How is physical therapy today?" she asked, accepting a mug of coffee from Maggie with a grateful nod. "The same," Thomas replied, his fingers tightening briefly around hers. "Dr. Michaels says I'm making progress, but some days it feels like I'm climbing a mountain that keeps growing." "Mountains don't grow, Dad," Sarah teased gently. "And if they did, you'd still climb them. You're the most stubborn man I've ever met." "Had to be," Thomas said, his voice softening. "How else would I have raised such a headstrong daughter by myself?" The familiar rhythm of their banter wrapped around them like a comfortable blanket. It had been just the two of them since Sarah's mother, Eleanor, had succumbed to cancer when Sarah was 15. Those difficult years had forged a bond between father and daughter that transcended ordinary family ties. When Thomas lost his sight, Sarah had been deployed with Special Forces, a fact few in Eagles Ridge knew. She'd come home immediately, leaving behind a promising military career to care for the man who had always been her anchor. "So," Thomas said, his fingers finding the menu he didn't need to read. "What looks good today?" This ritual, too, was part of their Tuesday routine. Sarah would read him the daily specials, though Thomas inevitably ordered the same thing, Maggie's meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans. The peaceful cadence of their lunch was shattered by the growl of multiple engines outside the diner. The sound crescendoed and then cut, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. "Motorcycles," Thomas said, his head tilting slightly. His years of blindness had sharpened his other senses. 4. No, 5 of them. Sarah's posture shifted imperceptibly, her back straightening, eyes flicking to the entrance. Old instincts died hard. The bell above the door jingled violently as 5 men entered, their heavy boots stomping across the linoleum floor. The smell of leather, cigarettes, and something sharper, something dangerous, filled the small diner. Conversation stuttered and died as the other patrons, Mrs. Henderson from the library, old Pete who ran the hardware store, and the Collins brothers who farmed just outside town, watched the newcomers warily. Well, a gravelly voice announced. "Ain't this just the quaintest little shithole you ever did see?" The speaker was a bear of a man, well over 6 feet tall with a barrel chest and arms heavily tattooed with skulls, snakes, and the distinctive emblem of the Night Riders, a skeleton astride a flaming motorcycle. His beard was wild and untrimmed, and a jagged scar bisected his left eyebrow. "This is a family establishment," Maggie said, her voice remarkably steady despite the white-knuckled grip she had on her coffee pot. "I'll ask you gentlemen to mind your language." The man's laugh was like gravel in a blender. "You hear that, boys? The lady wants us to mind our manners." His companions, a lanky man with greasy blonde hair, identical twins with shaved heads and prison tattoos, and a younger man whose nervous energy suggested he might be new to the group, snickered on cue. Axel Cross, the big man, introduced himself with a mock bow. "And these are my associates. We're just passing through your charming little town and thought we'd sample the local cuisine." Sarah's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly as she assessed the threat. The Night Riders were well known in certain circles, a motorcycle gang that had evolved from weekend warriors to something far more sinister, dealing in drugs, protection rackets, and wars throughout the mid-Atlantic states. What they were doing in a town as small as Eagles Ridge was concerning. "I think they should leave," Thomas said quietly, but not quietly enough. Axel's head swiveled toward their booth, his pale blue eyes fixing on Thomas with predatory interest. "What's that, old man? You got something to say?" Sarah's hand tightened on her father's arm, a warning. But Thomas Carter had faced down Taliban fighters in mountain passes. He wasn't about to be cowed by a bully in his hometown diner. "I said," Thomas repeated, his blind eyes somehow finding Axel with unnerving accuracy, "that you should leave. You're disturbing everyone's lunch." A dangerous silence fell over the diner. Axel stalked toward their booth, his heavy rings clicking against his belt buckle as he moved. "Dad," Sarah murmured, "not now." But Axel was already looming over their table, close enough that Thomas could smell the stale cigarettes on his breath. "Well, look at this." A blind old man trying to be a hero. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Do you know who we are, Grandpa?" Thomas's face remained impassive. "I know exactly what you are." "Dad," Sarah warned again, louder this time. Axel's attention shifted to her, his eyes traveling over her with insulting thoroughness. "And who's this?" "Your nursemaid." His grin revealed a gold tooth. "She's a pretty little thing. Maybe she'd like to come have some real fun with us instead of babysitting." The diner had gone utterly silent. Mrs. Henderson was clutching her pearl necklace so tightly it might snap. Old Pete had half risen from his seat but seemed uncertain what to do next. The Collins brothers exchanged glances, measuring their chances against 5 hard men. "You need to walk away now," Sarah said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made the younger biker shift uncomfortably. Axel laughed. "Or what, sweetheart? You'll scream for help." He reached out, his fingertips brushing a strand of hair that had escaped Sarah's ponytail. What happened next occurred so quickly that later, when the witnesses tried to describe it, their accounts varied wildly. One moment, Axel's hand was reaching towards Sarah's face. The next, his wrist was caught in a grip that made his knuckles white. Sarah hadn't even appeared to move, yet somehow, she had Axel's arm twisted at an angle that made the large man wince. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice still eerily calm. Axel's face flushed with rage and surprise. He tried to pull away, but Sarah's grip was like iron. The other bikers started forward, but Axel waved them back with his free hand, his pride clearly stung. "You've got 5 seconds to let go of me," he growled, "or my boys will tear this place apart." Sarah released him with a small push that sent him back a step. "I'm only going to say this once," she said, rising slowly to her feet. Though she stood nearly a foot shorter than Axel, something in her stance made him retreat another half step. "Leave now, and we can all forget this happened." The twins moved to flank their leader, hands drifting toward their belts where Sarah noted the outlines of concealed weapons. The lanky blonde had positioned himself near the door, cutting off the exit, while the nervous newcomer hovered uncomfortably by the counter. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, bitch," Axel snarled, rubbing his wrist. Sarah's smile never reached her eyes. "Actually, I do. You're Alexander Axel Cross, formerly of the 10th Mountain Division, dishonorably discharged in 2014 for assault on a superior officer. You founded the Night Riders in 2016, expanding from joyriding to drug running by 2018. You're currently wanted for questioning in connection with 3 assaults in Camden County and a suspected arson in Williamsport." The color drained from Axel's face. "How the fuck?" "Language," Thomas said mildly from his seat. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "I'm going to make one phone call. What happens next is entirely up to you." Axel sneered, recovering his composure. "Call whoever you want." By the time anyone gets here, we'll be done with this place." He turned to his companions. "Boys, I think it's time we taught this town some manners, starting with Miss Know-It-All and her blind old man." Sarah held his gaze as she dialed a number from memory. When it connected, she spoke just 4 words. "Crimson Sky at Maggie's." "That's it." Axel laughed. "Your big threat is Crimson Sky? What is that? Some kind of weather forecast?" Sarah pocketed her phone and sat back down, turning to her father. "Dad, I think we should finish our lunch. The meatloaf is getting cold." Thomas nodded, his unseeing eyes somehow conveying complete confidence in his daughter. "Excellent idea. Maggie's gravy is too good to waste." Axel's face contorted with fury at being dismissed. "You think this is funny? You think I won't?" The diner's door swung open, cutting him off mid-threat. A man stood silhouetted against the autumn sunlight, compact and steady in his stance. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt, but carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. His hair was clipped short, and a scar ran along his jawline. "Sarah," he said with a nod. "Thomas." "Mike," Sarah acknowledged. "Thanks for coming so quickly." Mike stepped inside, revealing 2 more men behind him, one black, one Hispanic, both with the same contained intensity. They entered silently, taking positions along the wall. Axel glanced from them to Sarah, uncertainty flickering across his face for the first time. Who the hell are these guys supposed to be? As if an answer, more figures appeared in the doorway. 2 women in their 40s, one with a prosthetic arm partially visible beneath her rolled-up sleeve. 3 more men, one using a cane similar to Thomas's. Then another group, and another, filing in with quiet efficiency until they lined the walls of the diner. Within 5 minutes, over 40 individuals had entered Maggie's diner. They made no threats, drew no weapons, simply stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the 5 bikers who now huddled together in the center of the room. Some of the newcomers bore visible scars or disabilities, but all carried themselves with the same unmistakable vigilance, the hallmark of those who had served in combat. "What is this?" the nervous young biker whispered to Axel, who seemed momentarily speechless. Sarah stood once more, her voice pitched to carry throughout the now crowded diner. "Gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to some friends of mine. Former members of various special operations units, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Green Berets, Force Recon Marines, and a few whose units I'm not at liberty to name." Thomas raised his coffee cup in a small salute. "My daughter's colleagues from her days with 5th Special Forces Group. Lovely people, once you get to know them." Recognition dawned on Axel's face. "You're Captain Sarah Carter, U.S. Army, retired," she confirmed. "And this is my father, Master Sergeant Thomas Carter, also retired. He served with distinction in 3 combat tours before losing his sight to an IED meant for his entire squad. The men he saved that day include 2 people in this room." 2 of the veterans nodded silently. "Now," Sarah continued, "I believe I suggested that you leave. That offer still stands." The twins had backed away from Axel, their earlier bravado evaporating under the steady gaze of dozens of combat veterans. The lanky blonde by the door seemed to be calculating his chances of slipping out unnoticed. Most surprising was the reaction of the youngest biker. He had gone pale, his eyes darting around the room with increasing recognition. Suddenly, he pulled off his leather jacket, revealing a faded Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm. "I'm out, Axel," he said, his voice cracking. "This isn't what I signed up for." "Shut up, Danny," Axel hissed. But Danny was already looking at the assembled veterans with a mixture of shame and desperation. "I served with 2 5th Marines in Helmand. Got back last year and couldn't find my way." His eyes found Sarah's. "I never knew what the Night Riders really did. I just needed somewhere to belong." One of the veterans, a woman with close-cropped gray hair and Lieutenant Colonel's eagles tattooed on her wrist, stepped forward. "What was your MOS, Marine?" 0311, ma'am. "Infantry." She nodded. "We all came home to different battles, son. Some of us just found better ways to fight them." The twins exchanged glances, then one of them spoke up. "My old man was Army, 101st Airborne in Desert Storm." He looked at his brother, who gave a barely perceptible nod, then both removed their Night Riders patches from their jackets and placed them on a nearby table. "I think we're done here too," the first twin said. Axel's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "You gutless." "Enough," Sarah interrupted. "It's over, Axel. Your crew is walking out on you, and you're outnumbered 40-1. Be smart for once in your life." For a tense moment, it seemed like Axel might explode into violence despite the odds. His hands clenched into fists, his breath coming in short, angry bursts. But even he couldn't deny the reality of the situation. "This isn't finished," he growled, jabbing a finger at Sarah. "I've got friends. Powerful friends who won't take kindly to this." "So do I," Sarah replied evenly. "And mine just showed up." With a final, venomous glare, Axel stormed toward the door. The veterans parted silently to let him pass, their eyes tracking him until he mounted his motorcycle and roared away, alone. The lanky blonde hesitated, then followed, leaving Danny and the twins standing awkwardly in the center of the diner. "What happens now?" Danny asked, sounding much younger than he had appeared when he first walked in. Sarah glanced at Mike, who stepped forward. "Now we talk about options. Real ones." The following weeks brought changes to Eagles Ridge that no one could have predicted. The confrontation at Maggie's diner had catalyzed something remarkable, a transformation that rippled through the small town like stones cast into still water. It began with Danny Morris, the young Marine who had been the first to abandon the Night Riders. Sarah introduced him to Dr. James Wilson, a former combat medic who now ran the VA outreach program in the county. Danny was diagnosed with PTSD and enrolled in both therapy and a vocational training program for veterans. The Collins brothers, whose family farm had been struggling, offered Danny part-time work helping with the harvest. Working outdoors, using his hands to coax life from the soil rather than cause harm, Danny began to find his way back to himself. The nightmares that had driven him to the false brotherhood of the gang began to recede, replaced by dreamless, exhausted sleep born of honest labor. The twins, Mark and Matthew Donovan, proved a more complicated case. Unlike Danny, they had been fully immersed in the Night Riders' criminal activities. Their initial defection had been born more of self-preservation than moral awakening. But when Sarah offered them the same choice she'd given Danny, rehabilitation instead of retribution, they were surprised enough to consider it. "Why would you help us?" Mark had asked suspiciously. "We would have hurt you and your old man if things had gone differently." Sarah's answer was simple, because revenge perpetuates cycles. Breaking them takes more courage. The twins' path to redemption wasn't smooth. The town was wary of them, with good reason. But Sarah had leveraged her connections to create something unprecedented in Eagles Ridge, a comprehensive rehabilitation program for veterans who had fallen into criminal lifestyles. Mike Delaney, Sarah's former teammate, had returned to town permanently to help run the program. With his background in both military intelligence and social work, he was uniquely qualified to understand the complex issues facing veterans who had strayed onto destructive paths. Most rehabilitation programs fail because they don't address the root causes, Mike explained at a tense town meeting 3 weeks after the incident. Many veterans turn to gangs or crime because they're seeking the structure, purpose, and brotherhood they had in the military. We're creating an alternative that provides those same elements, but channels them toward constructive ends. The program, which they named Operation Second Watch, after the military shift that bridges darkness into dawn, quickly gained momentum. A vacant warehouse on the edge of town was converted into a training center, offering everything from vocational skills to anger management and substance abuse counseling. What made the program unique was its integration with the community. Local businesses agreed to offer apprenticeships and jobs to those who completed the initial phase of rehabilitation. The Collins farm became a cornerstone, expanding its operations to accommodate more workers and adding therapeutic horticultural programs designed specifically for veterans with PTSD. Thomas Carter became an unexpected linchpin in the operation. His blindness, far from being a limitation, gave him a unique ability to connect with troubled veterans. When you can't see a person's tattoos or scars or the anger in their eyes, he explained to Sarah one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, he could feel, but not see. You hear what's beneath their words. The fear, the shame, the longing to be more than the sum of their mistakes. Not everyone in Eagles Ridge embraced the changes. Some, like Harold Pemberton, who owned the town's only bank, argued that bringing former criminals into their community was asking for trouble. "You're inviting wolves into our hen house," he proclaimed at a particularly heated town council meeting. "These people chose their path. Let them face the consequences." Sarah, who rarely raised her voice, stood to address him. "Mr. Pemberton, my father chose his path too. He chose to stand between harm and those who couldn't protect themselves. He paid for that choice with his sight." Her voice remained steady. "These men and women chose wrong paths, yes. But they're asking for the chance to choose again. Isn't that what this country is supposed to be about? The freedom to redefine yourself through your actions." Maggie Pearson, whose diner had been ground zero for the confrontation, became an unexpected ally. She offered jobs to program participants and created what she jokingly called redemption pie, a rich apple crumble that became a symbol of the town's transformation. "The apples are bruised, but still sweet," she told customers. "The crust looks rough, but holds everything together. And the whole thing's better for the fire it went through." Just as Eagles Ridge was finding its new rhythm, trouble arrived in the form of Marcus Cross, Axel's cousin and the Night Rider's second-in-command. Unlike Axel's brute force approach, Marcus was calculating and cold. He arrived alone, checking into the town's small motel under a false name, and spent days observing the community's patterns. His first move was to approach the twins, offering money and threats in equal measure to lure them back to the gang. When they refused, he targeted Danny, catching the young Marine alone as he walked home from the Collins farm one evening. "Axel sends his regards," Marcus said, stepping out from between two buildings. "He's very disappointed in you, Danny boy." Danny's hand instinctively went to the knife he no longer carried. 6 weeks of therapy and hard work had begun to heal him, but the fear that flashed across his face was real. "Tell Axel I'm done with that life." Marcus's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Nobody's ever done with the Night Riders, kid. You know too much. But I'm authorized to offer you a deal. Come back, tell us everything about this little operation Carter's running, and we'll welcome you home with open arms." Danny straightened his shoulders, looking Marcus directly in the eye. "This is my home now." What Marcus hadn't realized was that Eagles Ridge had changed in more ways than were immediately visible. Mike Delaney had implemented subtle security protocols throughout the town, veterans and townspeople alike keeping watchful eyes on newcomers, communication networks ensuring that vulnerable program participants were never truly alone. Danny had been seen walking with Marcus, and within minutes, Sarah received a text alert. By the time Marcus made his threat, Thomas Carter was already seated at a table outside the cafe across the street, his unseeing eyes turned in their direction, his phone recording every word. When Marcus left Danny with a final warning, he found Sarah waiting around the corner. "Marcus Cross," she said, as though greeting an old friend. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Marcus was leaner than his cousin, with sharp features and calculating eyes. "Captain Carter, your reputation precedes you, as does yours. Dishonorable discharge for selling military equipment on the black market. 3 years at Leavenworth. Founded the Night Riders with your cousin upon release." She tilted her head. "Did you really think we wouldn't be watching for you?" A flicker of unease crossed Marcus's face. "I'm just passing through, visiting an old friend. Danny's not your friend. And Eagles Ridge isn't a place for you to recruit or threaten people anymore." Marcus's hand drifted toward his jacket, but Sarah's next words stopped him. "I wouldn't. There are currently 14 veterans within eyesight of us, 3 of whom are former snipers. That tremor you feel in your chest? That's a laser sight from Bill Jenkins's position in the hardware store window." There was no laser, but Marcus's hand froze nonetheless. "You're bluffing," he said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Sarah smiled. "Am I? You tracked Danny, but you never noticed you were being tracked in turn. We've documented every move you've made since you crossed the county line. Every conversation, every threat." She pulled out her phone, showing him a screen filled with photos. Marcus at the motel, talking to known associates in neighboring towns, approaching the twins. The state police would be very interested in how these conversations match up with recent drug movements through the county. Fear replaced calculation in Marcus's eyes. "What do you want?" "I want you to leave Eagles Ridge and never come back. I want the Night Riders to understand that this town and everyone in it, including your former members, are under protection. Axel won't stand for this. Axel doesn't have a choice." Sarah's voice hardened. "The Night Riders have lost their foothold here. You can adapt to that reality, or you can fight it and lose everything." Marcus glanced around, finally noticing the ordinary-looking men and women who had casually positioned themselves nearby. A woman walking her dog, an elderly man reading a newspaper, a teenager sweeping the sidewalk, all watching him with the same steady gaze. "This isn't over," he said, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Actually," Sarah replied, "it is." 6 months after the confrontation at Maggie's Diner, Eagles Ridge hosted a small ceremony in the town square. The occasion was the graduation of the first cohort from Operation Second Watch, 12 veterans who had turned their lives around. Among them stood Danny Morris, now working full-time for the Collins brothers and taking night classes in agricultural management. The twins were there too, Mark having discovered a talent for carpentry while Matthew had become indispensable at Old Pete's hardware store. Most surprising was the presence of Axel Cross himself. 3 months after Marcus's departure, Axel had returned to Eagles Ridge, not with threats, but with a humility that shocked everyone who knew him. He had surrendered himself to the county sheriff, confessing to his crimes and offering information that led to the arrest of several high-level drug suppliers. His transformation had begun in a prison cell, where he'd had the opportunity to reflect on the direction of his life. A visit from Thomas Carter, arranged by Sarah despite her misgivings, had been the catalyst for change. "Why would you come see me?" Axel had asked through the prison phone, genuinely baffled. "After what I nearly did to you and your daughter?" Thomas's blind eyes had somehow found Axel's across the barrier. "Because I understand what it means to lose your way. To wake up one day in darkness and question everything you thought you knew about yourself." That conversation had led to others, and eventually, to Axel's inclusion in the Second Watch program upon his release. His journey was far from complete, but standing among the graduates, his usual bravado replaced by quiet resolve, he represented the program's most profound success. As Sarah watched her father present certificates to the graduates, she reflected on the unexpected turns life had taken. She had returned to Eagles Ridge expecting to simply care for her father, perhaps find some peace after years of covert operations. Instead, she had found purpose, not in combat, but in healing. Thomas's voice carried across the town square as he addressed the graduates. "In the military, we talk a lot about battles and enemies. But the hardest fight many of us face isn't against an external foe, it's the struggle to reclaim ourselves when we've lost our way." The autumn breeze caught his words, carrying them to where Maggie stood serving slices of her famous redemption pie to townspeople and visitors alike. The diner owner caught Sarah's eye and raised a piece of pie in salute. Eagles Ridge had changed. What had begun as a confrontation had evolved into something no one could have predicted, a model for veteran rehabilitation that was drawing attention from communities across the country. "The true measure of courage," Thomas continued, "isn't the absence of fear or failure. It's the willingness to stand up again, to choose a different path when the one you're on leads to darkness." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed into small, celebratory groups, Sarah found herself standing beside her father at the edge of the square. The setting sun painted the buildings in shades of gold and crimson, a vivid tableau her father could sense but not see. "We did good, didn't we, Dad?" she asked, slipping her arm through his. Thomas's smile was peaceful. "You did good, Sarah. I just provided backup. The best kind of backup." She rested her head briefly on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd find purpose here after leaving service." "Purpose finds us in unexpected places," Thomas replied. "Sometimes in diners, sometimes in confrontations. Sometimes in pie," Sarah added with a small laugh. "Especially in pie," Thomas agreed solemnly. "Speaking of which, I believe Maggie is saving us 2 slices." As they walked together toward the diner that had become the heart of their community's transformation, Sarah reflected that the greatest battles weren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes, they were won with courage, compassion, and the simple, powerful choice to see beyond what was to what could be. Behind them, the town square remained bathed in autumn light, a testament to a community that had learned that even the deepest wounds could heal, given time, care, and the chance to begin again.